approximately 1 p.m. Eastern Time. I didn't want to delay our presentation today, and so I want to go ahead and begin our webinar. So again, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar, the Model Programs Guide, Diversion Programs Implementation Guide. My name is William Moore, and I am with OJJDP's National Training and Technical Assistance Center. As your technical host, I would like to take a couple of minutes just to discuss a few features of the Adobe Connect webinar platform and provide a few announcements to keep in mind. For those wishing to download a copy of the PowerPoint slides and other important documents, you may do so by locating the handouts pod directly above the chat area. Here you will also find a FAQ for webinar participants that will likely address any technical related questions you may have. Click on the file name and then click the download button. At the end of today's webinar, there will be a Q&A session where the presenters will address some of the questions posed during the presentation. Please type your questions into the chat box as they arise. For those of you participating in today's webinar as a group, please take a minute to help us count. Go to the chat window and type in the total number of additional people in the room with you today. If you are viewing alone, there is no need to type anything into the chat pod at this time. At the conclusion of today's webinar, you will be provided with a link to a survey about today's presentation. The feedback you provide is used to assist in future planning and training. Following today's webinar, attendees will be sent a certificate of attendance. This certificate is sent approximately 1 hour following the conclusion of the event and is sent via Adobe Connect thank you email. Please keep an eye out for your email and your certificate. And finally, the webinar recording will be archived in approximately 1 week on OJJDP's NTTAC YouTube channel, where you can also view past webinars. For the transcript of the event and supporting materials, please contact OJJDP's NTTAC Help Desk. Again, thank you for joining us today. I will now turn it over to our moderator, Jennifer Tyson, for today's webinar.
Thanks, William. Hi, everyone. My name is Jen Tyson. I'm the research coordinator in the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention. I've also served as the project officer here for Model Programs Guide that we're going to be talking about today. I'll get into our agenda in just a few minutes, but before I do that, I want to give you a sense of who you're going to be hearing from today. So I'll briefly introduce my co-presenters, but just so you know, if you're interested in more of their background, there is the full bios are in that handout pod that William talked about. So joining me today, I'm going to go right to left since I'm on the right here. We also have Rachel Stevenson, who is the project director for both crimesolutions.gov and Model Programs Guide, and works at Development Services Group, and so we'll be hearing from her shortly. Also from Development Services Group, we have Denise Nazare. I'm sorry, Denise. I should have checked on the pronunciation of your last name before we started, but who's a research analyst in for Crime Solutions and Model Programs Guide as well with Development Services Group. And finally, we're going to be hearing from Darren Burrell, who's in Idaho's, he's overseeing Idaho's Fremont County and Clark County Juvenile Probation Departments. And so he's going to share a little bit about some experience he's had in using the I-Guide that we're going to be talking about today and some of his work, which I think is really interesting. So before we get into the agenda, we wanted to hear a little bit from you. We're going to do a little poll. So William's pulling this up. We want to know, how have you primarily used the Model Programs Guide? So if you just click in there and give us a sense of how you've used it. Also, if you haven't used it, you can let us know that. I'll give everyone a second to log their information here. All right, I think we've sort of gotten some numbers here. So it looks like the vast majority of you haven't used Model Programs Guide before. So that's actually great to hear that you're here today. We hope that you'll learn a little bit about a number of resources that we have on Model Programs Guide, in addition to the implementation guides that we're focusing on, but there are a vast variety of resources available. It looks like others have used Model Programs Guide to find evidence-based programs, which is the sort of longest running content and a lot of ways sort of core content on the site. So that's great to hear that that's sort of second most popular. All right. So I think we're going to close this poll and then ask you all one more question about who you are. So we're just going to give it a second to pull up here. So what is your background? We just want to get a sense of who we're talking to. Are you a criminal justice, juvenile justice sort of practitioner, somebody who works directly with people involved in the system, a training technical assistance provider, a treatment or service provider, a member of the community, a researcher, and other? Give us a sense. All right. So I think we've gotten a number of votes in here so far, and it looks like the vast majority are sort of criminal justice, juvenile justice practitioners. That's great. You're sort of our target audience with the Model Programs Guide, trying to make sort of taking research, which can sometimes be very sort of researchy, and try and make it more accessible to be able to be used. And so I'd love to hear from you, either through the questions or afterwards, about how you're finding the sort of resources and whether they're accessible and usable and understandable. It looks like the second number of, or highest sort of percentage of people we have are other, so I'm sure there's a variety of other careers and expertise that we haven't represented. And so anyway, but welcome everyone with the diverse backgrounds that you have. So I think we'll go ahead and close this poll and then move on into what we want to accomplish today. So we have three goals for today. One is to give you a little bit more information about sort of what is available on Model Programs Guide. That I think will be hopefully useful, again, for those who haven't really used the site before. We hope to give you an overview of how you can and what is on it. The second part is to dive a little bit deeper into something that's relatively new on the site, what we call implementation guides. And Rachel and Denise will talk about these more, but the implementation guides, the idea is that they sort of, before you start implementing one of the evidence-based programs on the site, sort of what are those steps you need to do to work with this sort of community or jurisdiction in which you're implementing them, sort of getting ready to implement that evidence-based program. And then last, we're going to hear from Darren a little bit about sort of how the state of Idaho and some of the work he's been doing there has used the Diversion Programs I-Guide. So we hope it'll give a sense, one, to sort of learn from Darren's experience. It's really sort of interesting, sort of all that he's been doing, working with partners in that state to do, but also sort of how can you maybe translate some of that experience that he's had to maybe bringing these resources back to the work you're doing. So those are our three goals. So the plan at this point is to get through those three goals through the presentation. If you have questions that come up along the way, please type those in the chat box that's in the middle here. The NTTAC staff, William, is going to capture them for the Q&A, and I think we're going to save all the questions and answers to the end just to make sure we can get through the content and to make sure, sometimes those questions are answered later on, so I think we'll save all the questions, but you don't have to hold your question. As they come up, just type them into the chat. William will grab them, and then we'll answer them at the end of the presentation. So with that, I'm going to start, give you a really brief background on sort of what is on Model Programs Guide, give you a sense of what's all available. So what you see here is a screenshot of Model Programs Guide. It's the URL, how you get to it is there. It's on our website, OJJDP.gov. I think that's / maybe a backslash, but it's the one on the screen, MPG, and you can see that's the homepage. So when you get there, you get some snapshots of the different types of information, which I'll get into. Before I do, I want to give you a little bit of background about sort of what Model Programs Guide is. This is something that dates back to 2000. It was originally developed as sort of a print, back before, computers were available in the 2000s, but it was originally developed as like a booklet around sort of evidence-based programs in delinquency prevention, so just with that sort of narrow focus around prevention. And it really grew out of some of the statutes behind OJJDP's work, sort of needing to use evidence-based programming and needing to support evidence-based programming. In 2005, it transitioned to an online database. So it's relatively, it's been an online database now for, I guess, 13 years. And it expanded that when it transitioned to be not just prevention, but also sort of intervention and reentry, sort of the whole breadth of the work that the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention does, but also, how many practitioners in the field, it's not just prevention, right? You're also working with system-involved youth. In 2011, the Office of Justice Programs, which is the larger bureau within which the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention sits, launched something that is crimesolutions.gov, and it's sort of built off of the process that was established in Model Programs Guide, a lot of the products and a lot of the work in Model Programs Guide, but it established a more rigorous process. It sort of had higher bars, higher standards for the evidence and how to review that evidence, research evidence, and sort of what made it in. And it also expanded the breadth because this is for the entire sort of Office of Justice Programs, which is not just juvenile justice, and now it included things like adult programs, criminal justice programs, as well as victim services. So in 2011, at the time we had sort of separate, databases, separate sites, but we started a process of aligning them because they sort of build off of each other, but it still had different standards. It was sort of an ongoing process. So in 2013, Model Programs Guide relaunched, and so we're now totally aligned with crimesolutions.gov. So it's crimesolutions.gov is something that you're familiar with. It's managed out of our National Institute of Justice, which is a sister agency here in the Office of Justice Programs. So that is, in terms of the program database, we share the same database. Model Programs Guide, the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention, we essentially just oversee and sort of project the information that has to do with juveniles. But there is, in crimesolutions.gov, a much broader content. If you also work with adults, for example, it's available there. And then in 2016, Model Programs Guide launched what we're talking about today, which is the implementation guides. So this was really sort of a new product for us. It's one that we're continuing to learn about and continuing to expand, but it was recognizing that sort of some of the limitations with having these sort of discrete programs, the idea that they're implemented in real-world settings where there's a lot of sort of conditions of implementation, and so trying to address some of those conditions, and we'll get to the background in a second. So what is on Model Programs Guide? It's, like I said, the sort of core content is a number of juvenile justice, youth violence prevention, intervention, and reentry programs. There's actually, this is currently 309 because I think when we did the screenshot there was 309, but it's a continuous, it's online. We're continuously adding new programs. I think one just got posted last night. I think we're actually at 311, so that's just sort of, it's ongoing when we post those programs. It uses research evidence about sort of evaluations that have been done about the programs to sort of say which of these programs work. Which of these are sort of promising that there's some evidence to support, some research to support that they might have achieved the outcomes that they intended to in criminal or juvenile justice, but there's also some limitations. We're not totally, as confident about those effects, so there's this promising. And also what Model Programs Guide has is sort of a category of programs about what does not work, what has not achieved its outcomes, and what has not, and potentially in some cases had a harmful effect, the sort of unintended consequences of implementing programs. If you're ever interested in looking for a particular program, the staff at DSG, me, my colleagues, we can point you to some other information and resources about those programs. There's a number of filters, there's a way to find them, there's a lot of information in that programs, and we're here to help if it's something you want to look in further. In addition to the programs, there are a number of literature reviews and links to additional resources and implementation guides, which I'll talk a little bit more in a second. So when I was talking about the programs, this is what we call the evidence rating system. So this is where you can see that the 3 types of programs that appear on the site, all of them are associated with one of these icons. So the green one, the top one that is effective, is the ones that have had the strongest evaluations, the ones that have demonstrated, the ones that we sort of feel the most confident in based on established sort of scientific criteria around the strength of the research evidence. Those are the ones that say effective. They have that strong evidence. If there's multiple studies in that direction favoring the program, they get this sort of fan icon. Then the next sort of tier of confidence is about the promising programs. Those get the yellow marks there. This fan is the same, where there's sort of multiple studies that maybe support the positive effect. And the red one is the one that was talking about that they don't demonstrate their intended outcomes in criminal justice or juvenile justice or prevention, and or include harmful effects. And in the description, it distinguishes between those, but the icon, it sort of just includes it there. The important thing to note here is that these ratings have to do with the research evidence behind a program. So it's not really talking about whether or not the program had a good theory or the program was good or bad. It's really about, what does the research say? What is the research confidence that the program led to some improved outcome, and an improved outcome in the field that we're in, which is the sort of justice field. So an improved outcome that is generally associated with either prevention or intervention for juvenile justice. So as I said, there's additional content as well. There are over 50 literature reviews. They're called literature reviews. It's something that honestly, this is something that we keep thinking of ways that we would like to be able to promote the sort of literature reviews more, because I think in a lot of ways they're untapped or less tapped than they should be on the site. And when people find them, I always get feedback like, oh, they're great. There's so much helpful information in here. So it's something we're trying to think about how to disseminate and sort of integrate into some of our other content. I think we've made some steps in that direction, but are continuing to think of new ways. But this is just a list of the topics that are covered in the literature reviews. So this is a great resource if you're thinking about, you have a sort of problem that a community member came to you with, and you work in a justice, let's say you were working in a court, you're a court administrator, and you need to, understand more sort of, how have families been engaged in the juvenile justice system. So this is actually we have a literature review on sort of what is the research around family engagement in juvenile justice. And so that's a great starting point, just sort of to know what's been out there around research of engaging families in the juvenile justice system. It's not necessarily going to be everything, but it gives you that sort of big picture overview about research in a broad variety of topic areas. And if you have a question that you don't see on this list, I would love to know what that is, because we really try and identify topics based on sort of needs that we identify through our grantees or practitioners. So definitely either in the Q&A or outreach afterwards would definitely, if you think there's something not on this list that you would really appreciate having more information about, definitely let us know. And then finally, the additional content on the Model Programs Guide, which again is the I-Guide, so the implementation guides. And so this is what we're focusing on really today in today's webinar, because like I said, it's a relatively new product. The other types of information have been around for a while. But the goal was really to build upon those other resources that we had available in Model Programs Guide around sort of taking research evidence, trying to sort of analyze it and say, what is this research evidence saying about these programs? What is the research evidence saying about sort of these general topic areas? But again, in recent years, and I think a number of us would probably, say based on our experience too, that, taking that sort of single program and trying to put it in, a real life setting with a real life, a variety of contextual factors where you have different people and different individuals and unique needs, and that it's not just like taking something off the shelf and implementing it, but that there are actually sort of all these sort of intervening variables and characteristics that could affect the way in which you implement that evidence-based program and the likelihood of success. So what these implementation guides were designed to address was more that sort of what has grown, I think, in the social sciences around implementation science. What do we know about sort of the way programs are implemented and programs in specific types of programs are implemented that others could learn from, that would maybe make the likelihood of identifying the right program fit for the right need or the right problem, and then making the sustainability more likely. So that is that the gaps of the implementation guides were really designed to build on. And Rachel's going to talk a little bit about how those are developed, what they're aiming to do, and then Denise will give an overview about the diversion one, which is again the sort of newest one that we've released and are going to be focusing on today. But they're problem-driven. The idea is to be community-focused, and that they're called pre-implementation oriented. Again, before you sort of try and implement a particular evidence-based program or practice. So, with that, I'm going to turn it over to Rachel. I think I covered a lot of content very quickly. Again, if you do have any questions, don't hesitate to type them in the chat box. Don't hesitate to follow up. I think afterwards you'll have some contact information for NTAC. We can help you find the resources that you're looking for. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Rachel, who's going to give us a little bit more sort of diving into now the implementation guides, the I-Guides, and how they're developed.
Thanks, Jen. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Rachel Stevenson, and I'm Project Director for the Model Programs Guide. So today, I'm primarily going to talk about the work that was completed by DSG in close collaboration with OJJDP that went into developing the implementation guides. I'll discuss the background research and the practitioner interviews that were conducted, both of which inform the development of the overall framework of the implementation guides. I'll briefly discuss that framework, which are these 10 steps of the pre-implementation process that Jen was just touching on, and then I'll describe how each I-Guide is created. So the development of the MPG implementation guides began under a new cooperative agreement between DSG and OJJDP. And so as Jen mentioned, the overall goal of the implementation guides is to enhance the information and the resources that are already available on MPG in order to better support MPG users who are interested in implementing evidence-based programs and practices. So the process began for us in 2013 with the creation of the MPG Implementation Guides Development Plan. So what this plan outlined was the approach that DSG would take to gather the background information on implementation science research, as well as users' perspectives on implementation and other relevant information. So all of this information is what was used to outline the MPG Implementation Guides protocols and standards, which would be the framework we would use to create all future I-Guides. So next we began a search of the literature on implementation and implementation science. This included a review of diverse implementation guides and frameworks that were already out there, especially in other fields like public health, as well as other implementation-related research you might find in program or process evaluations. And then from that empirical research, we identified a number of important factors and components that are related to the implementation process. And so with all that information in mind, from April to July of 2014, interviews and focus groups were conducted with 38 professionals in the juvenile justice field and other related fields. The individuals were interviewed because of their experience implementing programs, policies, practices, all that targeted youth in their community. So they were asked a number of questions with regards to their experience, such as what do you think are the key steps in the implementation process, and what are the major lessons you learned while implementing the program, among other similar questions that they were asked. So with all that information, we analyzed the responses from them to identify overall themes and key points with regards, again, to the implementation process. So we crosswalked the responses from the practitioners with that empirical research on implementation. And with all that gathered, we developed a final report entitled MPG Implementation Guides, Background and User Perspectives on Implementing Evidence-Based Programs, and I'll discuss that briefly next. The final report included that recommended implementation guides, protocol, and standard, including the 10 steps. In 2015, we worked on developing the first implementation guide, which focuses on the issue of school-based bullying. At the same time, in partnership with OJJDP's IT contractor, we helped to develop the implementation guides website. It was decided early on that the I-Guides would be an interactive website, a part of the MPG website, rather than just a PDF document. We presented a sneak peek of that first I-Guide at the American Society of Criminology annual conference in DC in November of that year. And then we continued work on the content of the first guide into 2016, receiving feedback from some external reviewers about the guide. That feedback ultimately helped us to finalize the language and the layout, and then in May of 2016, the implementation guide's website launched with the first I-Guide on school-based bullying programs included. And then almost immediately after that, we began work on the second I-Guide focused on juvenile diversion programs, which is what we're talking about today. And then once that was launched in June of 2017, again, we began work on the third I-Guide, which will focus on juvenile reentry programs, and that is tentatively scheduled for publication hopefully sometime this year. So as I mentioned before, the information we gathered from that lit search and from the practitioner interviews were put together in the final report. The final report includes more detailed information on the background research, that methodology we used to conduct the interviews and focus groups, and the findings from the discussions. The final report is available on the MPG website, and then there's a direct link here on the slide. And for now, I'm just going to provide a quick overview of some of what we learned regarding the practitioner's experience implementing programs in real-world settings. So in the end, we ended up conducting 15 one-on-one interviews and 3 focus groups. There were a number of different topics discussed during the interview. I'm only going to touch on a few. An important and a common point that was made by a number of the respondents related to getting staff buy-in. So we heard from frontline staff who said it was important to get administrators and leadership on board with the idea of implementing a new program. But at the same time, we also heard from people in leadership positions who said it was important to get buy-in from frontline staff, especially those who would be in charge of actually implementing the program. So through the interviews, we heard from a lot of different people in a lot of different positions with a lot of different points of views, but sometimes they were making the same point or similar points. Also, many respondents talked about the importance of keeping specific jurisdictional issues in mind as a program is selected and implemented. So examples of some of the specific jurisdiction issues that came up included challenges associated with implementing programs in different settings, such as rural, urban, or suburban communities. Or also challenges with implementing programs for specific targeted populations such as tribal youth, girls, or crossover youth. Some of those jurisdictional issues had not been identified by the respondents before the process began, and so this created unforeseen complications down the road. So one example from a respondent, she discussed implementing a multi-agency program targeting crossover youth, and for those who don't know, crossover youth are those that are involved in both the child welfare and juvenile justice system. So the initiative was actually a collaboration among court service personnel, judges, prosecutors, defense attorneys, and child welfare workers. But what the respondent described was actually how defense attorneys were resistant to the change at first, even though this was a program that could actually benefit their clients, because they didn't want judges in different agencies. So they didn't want the child welfare judge and the juvenile justice judge to obtain too much information about their clients because there was some information sharing involved in the collaboration. So this was just an example of specific issues that she had to deal with during the implementation process, and so many other practitioners had similar stories to tell. Another point that came up during the interviews, although this one we didn't necessarily find in the empirical research, was the importance of speaking to others about their implementation experience. Many respondents spoke with either colleagues in their communities or even staff in other jurisdictions to learn from others' experiences, especially if they found someone else implemented a program like the one they were looking at. Some even went as far as to conduct site visits to see what a program might look like in practice. But overall, what we found was no 2 respondents had the same implementation experience. Everyone had a different story to tell. But to develop the overall framework of the I-Guides, we relied on the empirical research to guide us, but we supplemented the research with information we gained from these interviews and focus groups. Overall, we wanted the implementation guides to be research-based, but also informed by the real-world experience of those in the field implementing the programs and practices. We wanted the I-Guides to feel, have less of a static feel, but rather we wanted the information to acknowledge and emphasize that dynamic process of implementation in real life, especially reflected in the interviews that we did. And so this is just a brief graph to show you some of the background of who we interviewed. We spoke with a lot of members of state advisory groups and some juvenile justice specialists and courts and probation, but we also talked to people in other fields like child welfare and education, and then we also talked to different types of practitioners such as technical assistance providers and direct service providers. So next I'm just going to briefly touch on the process that we use to create each of these I-Guides. DSG conducts a research review and synthesis of the research related to the factors that will likely affect the implementation of programs and practices, and then we translate these factors into this action-oriented guidance. And all the information I'm about to talk about, this is a page on the I-Guides that Denise will show you. And this is actually what the page looks like. What the slide illustrates is the process that was established to create each I-Guide. The process begins with selecting a specific problem that will be the focus of the I-Guide. This is done in consultation with OJJDP. And then next we establish the initial evaluation research base, which starts by looking at the program evaluations that we've already collected for the MPG program database, as well as other research we may have identified when we were developing MPG literature reviews, and also research from relevant juvenile justice practices featured on crimesolutions.gov. So a lot of leveraging existing resources, as we like to say. And then that's just at the very beginning of the process. After that, we review the research and the synthesis of what we call these implementation statements. And those are information from the research that relates in some ways to the 10 steps of the I-Guides. And I'll touch on the 10 steps at the very end. So for example, an implementation statement from a particular program evaluation could describe how staff are trained to implement a specific program. It could also be information about just a funding source or a grant that was used to start a program. There's just a wide variety of implementation statements that are pulled from the research we find. It could be a simple descriptive sentence from a study, or it could be a detailed paragraph with just a lot of information. So with those implementation statements, they're coded to what we call an implementation research coding instrument, which is available for download from the website. The coding instrument, which is basically an Excel spreadsheet, it allows us to see how much information from the research base is available across the 10 steps, but mostly it helps us to identify where there's gaps. So for example, for a particular program type or for a particular I-Guide like diversion programs, there may be a lot of information about program funding, but then no information about sustainability. And so then our next step is to identify research to try and fill those gaps. The identified implementation statements are then ordered and prioritized to determine what information is actually included in a particular I-Guide. So for example, implementation statements that we find from outcome evaluations of programs featured on MPG, those tend to be prioritized before information we find from other types of research. Next, the implementation statements are translated into these recommendations for each of the 10 steps, what are called the lessons learned in the I-Guides. And Denise will touch more on those. The recommendations are meant to be comprehensive, action-oriented, research-based, but most importantly, user-friendly. Those recommendations are assigned to one of four levels of evidence. And then next, and probably most importantly, we actually pull out examples from the research that relate to the recommendations we're giving. So for example, if one of the action-oriented recommendations has to do with identifying a program champion, we try to pull out an example from the research to show what that might look like or how that was done or what the process may have actually looked like. We also search for any related resources or links that can also be included in the I-Guides. And then finally, we send a draft of the completed I-Guide out to a relevant target audience to conduct usability reviews. So for example, the Diversion I-Guide, a draft copy was sent to juvenile justice and court personnel, and Darren was actually one of our reviewers. For the Diversion I-Guide, reviewers were located across the country, including Idaho, Virginia, and New York, and they provide us with really valuable feedback about the I-Guide, which we try to incorporate in the final draft. And so now we actually get to the 10 steps of the I-Guide. So just to show you, these are the first 5, and then these are the next. We didn't get it all on one slide, unfortunately. The 10 steps represent the framework of the I-Guides. I'm not going to go into detail about each one of them. There are definitions for each step available on the website. I'll just the next 2 presentations will briefly touch on a few steps. I'm just going to give an overview. So again, the 10 steps were identified and organized based on all that research we found at the very beginning and the responses during the interviews and the focus groups. These 10 steps are consistent throughout all of the I-Guides, so the specific information provided will depend on the topic of the I-Guide. So for the first I-Guide, the 10 steps relate to implementing school-based bullying prevention programs. For the second I-Guide, the focus was on these 10 steps in the context of implementing diversion programs for juveniles. And then in the upcoming third I-Guide, the focus will be on the 10 steps as they relate to implementing juvenile reentry programs. And again, the amount of research or the amount of recommendations we're able to provide entirely depend on just the topic area. If there's a lot of research to really pull from, you know, we try and provide what we can, but in some areas there's just not a lot. These 10 steps are organized across the 3 S categories: start, support, and secure. So the first 5 steps are in the start category, and so these steps relate to building a solid foundation before implementing an evidence-based intervention. The next 3 steps are in the support category, so these steps assist with putting a program or practice into place. And then the last 2 are in the secure category, and these steps relate to stabilizing and sustaining the program or practice within the community. The 3S categories are meant to help organize the 10 steps into related ideas, but they are not meant to establish a specific order to the steps. In designing the I-Guides, we didn't want to emphasize a specific linear approach to implementation, as we had noticed other frameworks had done. Rather, we wanted the I-Guides to be useful to anyone during any point of the pre-implementation process. So now I will turn it over to Denise, who will talk about the Diversion I-Guide.
Thank you, Rachel. My name is Denise Nazaire. I am a research analyst at Development Services Group, and I work on the Model Programs Guide as well as crimesolutions.gov. So I'll just go into talking specifically about the Diversion I-Guide, as well as helping to navigate the website so that you all can find the information on the website. So the goal of the Diversion Program I-Guide was to answer the question, what should I do to implement a program or practice in my community that can divert youth away from formal system processing in the juvenile justice system? In general, diversion programs allow youth who commit offenses to be directed away from more formal juvenile justice system involvement. Some of the diversion programs are pre-trial and pre-disposition, which mean that youth are diverted away from system processing at the outset. However, there are other programs that begin only after formal adjudication or an admission of guilt. And in those cases, youth are diverted away from detention or incarceration, but are still formally processed. So given those 2 types of programs, we wanted to, in terms of the scope of what we included in the Diversion I-Guide, we only looked at programs that were pre-adjudication, where the youth were diverted away from formal processing prior to adjudication. Any post-adjudication diversion programs that were alternatives to detention or secure confinement were not included in this I-Guide. Also, we looked at program evaluations that had outcomes related to behaviors or the well-being of youth that were diverted from the system and their families. So these outcomes range from recidivism to justice system cost, family functioning, mental health, and substance abuse. And so those are just some of the examples of outcomes that we looked at when looking at program evaluations to include in the Diversion I-Guide. I do want to make a note that due to the limited amount of research available on law enforcement and school-based diversion programs, that they were not included in this I-Guide for the most part, though there may be 1 or 2 examples that we felt were especially useful to include. And so that's the scope of everything that's included in the Diversion I-Guide. So I just want to start with a brief overview of diversion. Diversion is predicated on the belief that formal system processing has criminogenic effects, and that alternatives to incarceration, such as decriminalization, deinstitutionalization, and diversion, are better for long-term youth development. So in creating informal channels to navigate youth away from traditional processing, diversion programs are opportunities to correct youth's antisocial behaviors with the assistance of their families and the community rather than the justice system. Diversion programs are intended to hold juveniles accountable for their behavior, but without formal court involvement. As an alternative to traditional processing, diversion programs are designed to reduce the stigma, reduce coercive entry into the system and unnecessary social control, to reduce recidivism, and provide youth with services that they would not have received otherwise, and connect them to their broader community and services in the community. So there are a variety of diversion programs that we found in doing the research, and these are just 5 that are listed here. The teen courts, mental health courts, restorative justice interventions, truancy prevention and intervention programs, as well as mentoring programs. These are just 5 that we've highlighted. Of course, there are different ways that diversion programs may present in the field, and those would be included as well. But we just wanted to highlight a few. And then also, in terms of the categories of diversion programs that we found in the research, there's 2 main categories. There's the informal or caution and warning programs that are the least invasive and serve to divert youth out of the system with little to no further action. So in these cases, they emphasize warning youth about future consequences of continued antisocial behavior. These warnings can come from family members or local law enforcement. In terms of law enforcement, juveniles who are diverted by police officers can be warned and released with no conditions, released and referred to community-based services, or discharged without pending charges. But if no further contact with the law occurs, many of these post-arrest charges are dismissed after a specified amount of time. The more formal types of diversion programs that we found in the research usually occur after arrest, but again, it's prior, there's no adjudication. So the 2 components are a justice component, there is a police decision or some kind of court processing, and then there also is a service component. So typically after charges are filed, youth can be referred by prosecutors or judges to programs that range from simple surveillance to participation in an intervention in the community. Conditions of the formal diversion tend to include some form of admission of guilt, but an agreement to participate in the available and suitable programming, and that when successful completion of the terms of the agreement usually result in no additional judicial processing. And so that's just a brief overview of the diversion programs and the conceptualization of diversion for this I-Guide. So I'm going to transition to the website to demo how to navigate. Give me one moment to share my screen. Okay. So this is the main homepage for the Model Programs Guide. It begins with an overview of the site. Then it goes into more details about the categories and steps of the I-Guides that Rachel discussed earlier, and so we have them listed for you here. Another thing that I should point out is that there are puzzle pieces for each of the 3 main categories, the 3 S categories. And if you click the puzzle piece on the side for Start, it will open up and show you the 5 steps that fall under this main category. And you'll be able to see the information on how we define these steps. You can also use the puzzle piece to close that section and open the next. And so that's just a navigational tool there so that you can contain the information on your screen in a way that's more useful. And so that's the main home page. You'll notice on the side that there's a blue navigation box, and we will be using that throughout this demo. Also included on the main Model Programs Guide homepage is the About I-Guides on the navigation bar. In this area here, there are 5 web pages that detail a lot of the information that Rachel discussed earlier. It talks about the categories and steps in more detail. There's a glossary of terms, some of the frequently asked questions that people may have about the I-Guides, as well as the I-Guide creation. This document here talks more about the systematic review process and the interviews that we conducted in creating the framework for the implementation guides, and so you can go there. I do want to navigate to the standard of evidence page. This page here details, gives information about the 4 levels with which we categorize the research, whether it was compelling evidence, reasonable evidence, minimum related evidence, or minimum evidence. And what really these categories of evidence mean are that for compelling, these were all programs that had been previously reviewed by MPG and rated as either effective, promising, or no effects. And so we were able to really pull information from those categories of programs. In terms of reasonable, these programs met the minimum standards for review for MPG, but they may have been rejected due to insufficient evidence, or they did not complete, or they're still in the review process. The minimum related evidence programs for 2 stars, these were programs that did not meet the minimum standard of review for Model Programs Guide due to them being case studies or process evaluations. However, the topics of those programs did relate to information and programs that we typically include on Model Programs Guides, such as delinquency prevention, and came from credible sources such as peer-reviewed journals. And then the last evidence rating for minimum evidence consisted of programs that did not meet the standards for review for MPG, and they did not have topics that were related to what we typically include. However, they came from credible sources, and so we were able to pull some information from them as well. And so these are just the 4 levels of evidence, and you can navigate to this page to find out more details about them. So just going back to the home page, and we have the I-Guide type topics here. The first one that we created was based on school-based bullying prevention, and then the one that we're talking about today is the diversion programs. And of course, there's some related resources that we have here that you can navigate to as well. So this is the main home page for diversion programs. It starts off with an introduction and an overview for the Diversion I-Guide. If you scroll down, they will give you the goals of the I-Guide that I discussed a bit earlier, as well as a brief background on juvenile diversion programs. You'll notice here that there is a link. This is a link to the literature review that we have on Model Programs Guide for diversion, and so you'll be able to find more detailed information about that as well from this page. And then at the bottom of the page are the steps to take for diversion programming for the I-Guide. All of these links here will link to actual information that we've developed and pulled from the research for each of the steps. And so I just wanted to show you that. And so I will go ahead and navigate to the first step and kind of talk about the format of the pages, and then talk a little bit more about the details of the information that are on that page. So the first step under the Start category is establishing clear program goals. And you'll see here that the puzzle piece says Start, and this will change throughout as you click through the different pages in the I-Guide to match with the categories that are listed on this right-hand side. And so that's just a place so that you can see as you're going through where this might fit in to your implementation process. So there's an overview of what we mean by establishing clear program goals specifically in relationship to diversion programs, and we talk about some of the potential goals that your diversion program can have. You'll notice on all of the Diversion I-Guide pages that there is a box with steps to take or lessons learned from the research that Rachel had mentioned earlier. Like I just mentioned, this box is consistent throughout all the pages, and it summarizes the information that will be in each page so that you can have a screenshot of what the steps are and some of the subpoints. So, for example, one of the recommendations or lessons learned from the research is to define the problem and the target population. You'll notice that this is a hyperlink, so you will be able to click the link to navigate to that section of the page, which I'll do shortly. But also, the same as I've indicated before, you can use these puzzle pieces at the side to open and to close these sections. And so I'll just scroll back up and show you to navigate to that section. So there's two ways to really get to the information on the page. I do want to point out that on some of the pages there will be a green call-out box. The information that we have in these boxes we felt were useful to help with understanding some of the content that's already on the page. So in this case, there's a risk needs assessment, defining the three principles of risk needs and responsivity in this box. But in other I-Guide call-out boxes throughout the I-Guide, you might see a highlighted program or a highlighted tool or assessment that we felt brought some useful information to developing the I-Guide. Also, you'll notice that there are active links throughout the content, and so when we give an example from a specific program, if there is an associated program profile on crime solutions, it will be a hyperlink, so I'll just navigate to that briefly. So it brings you to the program profile. It shows you the evidence rating. There's a summary and more detailed information about that program, the program goals, theory, and components. And so this is the layout for the program profile on crime solutions. So all of the links will bring you to the program profiles that we're pulling examples from. And I just want to scroll down a bit. You'll notice that there are some that are bolded in black, and that just indicates that we do not have a program profile for those programs, but we still, they probably fell under some of the other evidence categories, and so we pulled information from them as well. And then the last thing in terms of navigating the website, throughout you will see references to other steps in the process. So this one is do supportive research. We talk about the risk needs assessments in this area, and so it will help you to navigate to more information about that on another page or another place in the I-Guides that we talk about that information. And again, it'll, for the most part, tell you when there is a literature review associated with that topic. So right here is a risk needs assessment for youth, so you'll have that link to navigate to. So in terms of information about diversion, you'll see, and I'm just going to scroll up, that we talk about defining the first recommendation or the lesson learned is defining the problem and the target population. And here we talk, there's the three main subcategories under the step. It's really about understanding that there are problems that diversion can address, and then there are problems that diversion cannot address. So some of the problems that throughout the research we found that diversion programs tend to address were recidivism or high reoffending rates, negative consequences that are associated with having a criminal record, having a lack of services for youth with disabilities or special needs, or lack of rehabilitative services in the community for youth. And so those are some of the main types of goals that some of the diversion programs had. And then diversion programs were not used to address establishing legal sufficiency, meaning that you tend to not use a diversion program to determine whether a complaint against a youth falls within the jurisdiction of the juvenile court, and whether the allegations can be substantiated. And so it's important to really know what your diversion program can and cannot address. We also talk about defining the target population, and this was especially important throughout the research to be specific about the criteria used to define your population, whether it was juveniles who committed first offenses, status offenses, misdemeanors, or nonviolent felonies. Some of the programs had mixed populations, and that's noted throughout, but identifying your population at the outset can help with assessment later on, determining the resources that you'll need, the cost of your program. And so these are one of the lessons learned that we had from the diversion, in developing the Diversion I-Guide. And then last, I just want to talk about, so the title of this page, or this step, is Establishing Clear Program Goals. And so what we found was useful was the development of the SMART framework, and using that after you've defined the problem and your target population to then develop your goals using this framework, having specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-bound goals. So for example, the framework or the goal of your diversion program could be, in the first 6 months of operation, the juvenile diversion program will decrease formal processing of nonviolent youth who commit first offenses by 5%. So these are specific and measurable goals, and there's a timeline on it. They're relevant and they're achievable. And so this is something that we found that was consistent throughout the research, and so one of the lessons learned that we've identified. And for every point, we tend to have an example of what that means, and of a program that actually implemented this step in their development of their diversion program. And so I will just go back up to the top, and this box on the side is consistent throughout all of the pages in the Diversion I-Guide. So I'll just navigate to providing program training, and you'll see here that this puzzle piece is changed to support, and it's the second step under the support category. Again, there's the lessons learned box, and there's 2 main points here and 4 subpoints to the lesson that we developed. So if you click again on that link, it'll bring you to that part of the page, and then this is just some more information about that. And in the interest of time, I won't be going through all of it. And so the other, I just want to navigate to one other thing, is right here in this box is the references and the levels of evidence. So if you click here, it will bring you to citations and the ratings for each of the evidence that we've used throughout all of the Diversion I-Guide. So if you're looking for the resources, if you want to go and find the information yourself, or really look at some of the programs that we've given examples for that may not have a program profile on Crime Solutions, but you can use the citations to find those documents. And you'll notice from the introduction it has all of that, but then also for the individual pages in terms of establishing clear program goals, each section and each lesson learned has its own evidence listed underneath it, so it's really organized in a way that you can go to that specific section and find what you're looking for. And so I will navigate back to the slide. And give that a moment to go back to the PowerPoint. Okay, and then I see that there's a question that I probably should answer before I navigate back. Is there a way to filter or search by program goal? There's not a way to filter or search by program goal. You would search by the steps in the process, and so under the goals we just list a few, but there's not a way to actually search by program goal. And that is because a lot of diversion programs have different goals, and we couldn't cover all of them, but we wanted to give you a basis for understanding how you might establish clear goals. And that's the end of my part, and I just wanted to transition to Darren, who will take over and give an example about how the Diversion Implementation I-Guide could be used in a locality.
Great. Thank you, Denise. Warm greetings from Idaho to everyone across the nation that's listening today. Just a really quick background about Idaho that I wanted to give so my comments might make a little more sense is Idaho, the juvenile justice system is actually a bifurcated system, and what that basically means is it's divided into two parts. So we have probation services that's tasked to the counties to oversee, and then the State Department of Juvenile Corrections handles those that require more intensive services and probably stays in confinement to deal with their issues and address their needs. So Idaho, when I say that, Idaho actually has 44 different counties that is tasked with probation. So you have potentially 44 different ways of doing probation, and within those individual counties you have their individual judges and court systems, prosecutors, public defenders, and then the probation department. So when you talk about trying to find something like diversion to get to 44 different ways of doing things, it can be a bit overwhelming. And so I just want to say, as a state, we have, like most other states, we have a state advisory group called the Idaho Juvenile Justice Commission, and diversion happens to be one of the priority issues we've been working on, or the deinstitutionalization of the status offenders, or DSO, like many of us are aware. We have some awesome supports and rock stars, I call them, within or on that commission. Alan Miller just does some great work. He provides support, guidance, and collaboration. And Chelsea Newton has been specifically tasked helping new program developments across the state, specifically to diversion. So I just appreciate them in Idaho, what they've helped us with. So here's kind of where we're at. Is in 2017, as part of this goal we've been working on for several years, Idaho actually had or in partnership with that state advisory group, hosted a one-day diversion forum, and it was to discuss the importance of diverting low-risk, first-time offenders, and how to collaborate with community partners to either establish or enhance new programs. And again, we're talking about these 44 different counties trying to find something to work for them. There were around 200 professionals that attended, school officials, law enforcement, probation officers, prosecutors, and even some magistrate judges. We had actually 30 of the 44 counties in the state attend that summit, and we actually also had some tribal representation along with state employees, so we were kind of excited about that. The caveat to that is that was right before this Diversion I-Guide was released. It was in the works. I knew it was coming. I'd been working with Rachel and her team and talking about it, and I was excited, but it wasn't quite ready. But however, the partners that I work with in Idaho, I told them, hey, this is going to be coming, and we talked about that. And so Chelsea last year was able to kind of preempt this I-Guide before it was released. So since it was released, we actually had a forum this last month, on the topic related to diversion, but more of restorative justice. And during that time, Chelsea was able to refer to the I-Guide and talk about that. So that big picture, macro level, I guess, speaking to the state of Idaho, according to Chelsea, we've had some success on that, and referring, she printed off some copies for those that may not have access to a computer and bound them up and made them really nice and presentable. More diversion programs have been implemented in Idaho since these two summits and help with utilizing the I-Guide. And I understand that in some areas referrals are increasing dramatically. So that's kind of what I wanted to talk about at the macro level. That's kind of anytime a program is rolled out, I think there's a specific challenge, whether it's those that develop a program or perhaps those that may live in a community that may not have access to certain services, or we're talking about the different rural, urban, or suburban areas. I think it's a challenge to develop a program that meets the needs of all three. And from my experience, this guide truly does. It's kind of exciting to me. And so I've talked at kind of the macro level. I want to talk a little bit briefly about kind of the micro level, or what I've experienced within my department, my agency that I oversee. So I've actually had a diversion program established. We've had it for several years, and it is a pre-trial diversion program. We work closely with our stakeholders, our partners, our prosecutor, and we do our best to divert the low risk and definitely status offenders out of our system. However, after I had an opportunity to review this guide, I thought, this would be a great opportunity to sit down with our stakeholders within my county, which would include our public defender, our prosecutor's office, and also our magistrate. I needed that key buy-in. And I tried to get the ball rolling. A challenge, and I was excited, and I shared this I-Guide with these partners. What I experienced, though, is our magistrate judge, he is retiring, and he has kind of some other things on his mind right now, and juvenile justice and changes specific to diversion just wasn't and isn't on his mind, and probably rightly so. I think he wants a new magistrate to be behind whatever we're doing to be able to support it. And so despite all of my excitement and ready to make some adjustments, not fully change, but I wasn't able to do that. And that's specifically, if you haven't read the module specific, I think it's Module 5 that talks about identifying specific stakeholders. And then I loved Module 8. And Module 8 is entitled Addressing Adaptation. So anytime that if you've implemented any program, things happen, things change. And what's really stuck out to me with this guide was that's not a big deal. This guide understands that there will be changes, whether it's funding, whether it's staff or other issues that might implement or impact your program. There always will be changes, but that's not a big deal. It's to be expected. I just greatly appreciated that. Really, I think that's kind of all I had. I mean, I think I said this, but this is maybe a trite way to say it, but we hear the term one size fits all in terms of clothing or whatever, but this is, I think it did a great job to be as close to being a one size fits all for any type of program implementation, wherever you're at in the U.S. or agency. It's kind of there. There's a lot of great things within that. So that's all I have. I hope that kind of made sense, and I will turn probably back to Jennifer, I'm assuming.
Yeah, great. Thank you very much, Darren. I think your points are so interesting about I think where both the sort of complexity of Idaho and that bifurcated system and the sort of all counties, and I'm sure you're not alone in that experience, though every sort of system is unique. But I think your point about that it was sort of a right time, right, to sort of use this I-Guide, because it was sort of at the starting point of maybe like looking at sort of some of the processes you'd all been doing around sort of diversion programs. and so it was sort of like an opportunity to say, okay, what can we learn from the way these have been implemented in the past, and what, how can we sort of embrace that learning? And so I think that that's just such a great point that you made about sort of it was, that the I-Guide, it's not going to be a one-size-fits-all, but if to the extent that you can learn from other people and the way that these sort of programs have been implemented, especially as you might be embarking on a new sort of either system improvement or system change, that it can be helpful to guide that. And I just think your story about that is really interesting and great. So thank you very much for sharing it. With that, I think we are we have about 20 minutes for questions. I know there's a couple in the chat box, so I'll start with them. As I'm starting with them, if you have more questions, please continue to put those in the chat, and our administrators for the webinar will get them over. So the first one is just a statement, but I'm going to read it to make sure you know that we got it. Somebody recommended that they would like to see cognitive development in the literature review section. So I think, thank you for the recommendation. I will say the literature reviews are generally about sort of either prevention or involvement in the justice system. So I'm going to assume that this has to do with sort of like the adolescent cognitive development and maybe what the intersection is with the juvenile justice system. So I think it's a good suggestion. If it's a broader sort of thought, or if I didn't understand the suggestion, feel free to clarify that in the chat. The next question was, can you please go over how to get to the literature review section of the website? So everything we presented here today, if you go to OJJDP.gov /MPG, I will type it into the chat thing here. So that URL, that'll take you to the homepage for Model Programs Guide. And so each of the sort of information pieces, that's the best starting point. On that homepage, you'll see it says literature reviews. Click here. You can see all the literature reviews. Programs. Click here. You see all the programs. And then implementation guides. So it has boxes for each of those that you can click to. So the next question is, will there be a lit review on mindfulness, meditation, and/or yoga? There's not one in the works, so I appreciate the suggestion. And I did see in the chat that there was a little bit of sharing about one that I think the Poverty Center out of Georgetown had developed. And so that was shared in the chat box. But in terms of the literature review, I think it's a good suggestion. So we will catalog that and take it into consideration. And then Denise, I think, answered the next question, which was, is there a way to filter search by program goal? And we think that was specific to the implementation guide. So I think Denise already sort of addressed it. In that case, it's not necessarily by program goal. But I will say, in terms of the program list on Model Programs Guide, that there is the option to filter by a number of sort of different topics, like different filters. So it can be anything from sort of topics that are covered, but also some risk and protective factors. So there's a whole drop-down list that you can filter the programs at least by. It's not technically program goal, but a lot of those topics sort of, because of the sort of breadth of the topics, some of them are sort of like goals of the program. The next question is, do you have a list of programs that you have researched and rated based on EVPs? I'm looking for information on school-based group mentoring programs and any EVPs for them. So I think that EVPs is evidence-based programs, or maybe I'm missing what the acronym EVP is. But so the programs that have been reviewed for Model Programs Guide are on the list. There's actually another resource that OJJDP sponsors that's specific to mentoring. So since your question is about school-based group mentoring, it's the National Mentoring Resource Center. So there is actually a collaboration between that site and Model Programs Guide in that there's a program list on that is sort of the same. in terms of their mentoring programs that go by the same criteria we talked about for Model Programs Guide. But the Mentoring Resource Center also has other much broader resources for mentoring. So one of it is they do these sort of topical and population-specific reviews, and one of them is on school-based mentoring. So I think I can send, when I'm sort of done with the questions, maybe we'll put up the National Mentoring Resource Center, but if you just Google OJJDP National Mentoring Resource Center, it sort of has what sort of what works section there, and you can look at by topic or by population focus, and there is a school-based mentoring. It's a really good, it's done by a number of researchers that are pretty prominent in the mentoring field, and so it really synthesizes research in that area. Okay, so, there is the link to the National Mentoring Resource Center. There's also a Contact Us button on that National Mentoring Resource Center, so if you can't find what I tried to describe in that answer, feel free to contact the site and they can help you navigate. And then I'm just going to read the comment about, this is the inquirer about the cognitive development that the person was thinking about it in terms of having information on impaired cognitive development that could inform decisions about choosing an innovative or program to implement for differing populations. For example, if impulsiveness is strongly linked to one type of outcome, certain programs may not work if they don't take into account these factors. I would love to hear your thoughts. I think that's a great point, and actually I think that sort of draws on a number of great points about sort of, I mean, one, and I think Denise talked about this a little bit, but the idea of risk, needs, and I think responsivity for individuals. If you're sort of trying to apply a single program for an individual that may have some cognitive development, I mean, that's an issue about responsivity. They're not necessarily going to be the right, it might not be the right match, and I think that's a really good point. So I will say, I think the way the resources we do have sort of address it maybe from that perspective. There's a lot on sort of risk and needs assessment. There is actually a literature review on intellectual and developmental disabilities and sort of the context of that in the juvenile justice system. And that is available in the literature review. Now, in terms of the implementation guides, I don't think it's been addressed yet, but I think it's a good point. But there are some resources at least about that, and sort of, I think both in like sort of program match and responsiveness, as well as sort of broader literature reviews. And I'll pause now because I've been talking a lot, and Rachel and Denise also have a very probably vaster knowledge about the resources on Model Programs Guide. Denise and Rachel, can you think of anything else to note about that question that I didn't maybe think of?
No, I think the lit review, it's called, Youth with Intellectual and Developmental Disabilities in the Juvenile Justice System. It kind of gives, like you described before, kind of an overview in a context of what that looks like in the juvenile justice system. I don't know if it touches on the specific issues that were discussed, but it's kind of a starting off point, I guess, with that discussion. But I can't think of any specific other resources we might have. It is not a heavily researched topic, so I don't think there's any MPG programs that touch on that specifically. But definitely one that, you know, if we were able to find a program, we'd be interested in including on MPG.
Which is actually a good point to just follow up on. If you go to that website, ojjdp.gov/MPG, there's a way to nominate programs. It's a button there. You can nominate the program. And so it goes through the crimesolutions.gov nomination process, but it's a great way. I mean, the research team at DSG does a lot of sort of literature searches trying to identify programs, but you know, there's always programs that if it's been evaluated, we would love to know about it. I mean, that's the caveat, that there has to be an evaluation. There's a lot of clear criteria on what that evaluation should, the sort of methods of that evaluation. So if that doesn't exist, you know, it probably wouldn't be able to be reviewed. But if it has been evaluated, we would, you know, if you can send us the link to the evaluation report or send us a copy of it through that nomination, that would be great. We would, and this isn't specific to this topic, any program that anyone's aware of. Okay, so I think we've gotten to the end of the questions that were already in the evaluation. So now there's another question about where can I find the evaluation criteria. So if you're in OJJDP.gov /MPG, there's an About MPG, About Model Programs Guide section. In there, it talks about the different resources on the site, and it describes the criteria for review, and that it essentially just links to crimesolutions.gov's site, and there's information there about, for programs, the scope of the topic, the sort of minimum screening criteria for evaluation research, and then the more in-depth assessment. So each of the evaluations actually undergo an independent sort of review by two researchers, that have expertise in methodology around a sort of objective set of criteria and around the evaluation. So those instruments that they use to do that sort of review are all posted online. But the screening criteria are probably the things that I would pay attention most. Like, is it in scope and does it have an evaluation? And then the rest of it, the team of contracted research staff would be able to review. And then there's another question related. Are there links to the original research articles from the program evaluations? So the answer is yes. So when you view the list of programs in Model Programs Guide, it first starts with a list that just sort of says a name of a program, that rating, and a brief description. When you click on the name, it brings up what we call the program profile, and it provides a lot of information. It provides an overview of the program, it provides an overview of the outcomes, it provides an overview of the evaluations. It provides what we call the evidence base, which is essentially getting to the question, which is the original sources for the evaluations. It also includes other references, which are a lot of times, there are a lot of qualitative or descriptive information that isn't necessarily assessed. It's not an evaluation per se, but it's helpful information. And so anything that we're aware that's sort of research about that program, all those references are included in the program profile. So the next question, are there resources for needs assessment suggestions? So there is a literature review in terms of Model Programs Guide. There is a literature review on risk and needs assessments. I would definitely check that out. The OJJDP also has a couple ongoing projects around risk and needs assessments. We are working on a bulletin around the implementation of risk and needs assessments. That is still sort of in development, but that will hopefully be coming out soon. And then we have a number of project pages describing this work. So if you go to OJJDP.gov, there's a research and statistics section. You can see project pages, and that's a way to find out some of the information. But for now, I would go to the risk and needs assessment literature review on Model Programs Guide. Okay, so I think there's another question coming in. Are there resources to assist with staffing? That is a good question. In terms of specific, I assume, actually I'm curious if the sort of requester could clarify what they're thinking about in terms of staffing. I'm going to pause for a second. Okay, so appropriate skills and qualifications needed. So, so the question is, are there resources to assist with staffing, appropriate skills and qualifications needed? So generally, the information on Model Programs Guide would describe the sort of evaluation around a program, and included in that is sometimes implementation information. And so I think it depends on the program. It depends on sort of how much it was a curriculum and how much this was documented. And so I think it really varies on the program and the type. In terms of the implementation guides, I mean, there is some about the sort of, the key stakeholders and participant buy-in that doesn't really get to necessarily like appropriate skills and qualifications. It does talk to the types of people you want involved, which is a little bit of that. But there's not necessarily, these resources aren't necessarily like specific guidelines, like this is who you have to hire, this is what like their position description would be, this is what their background should be. If that's what the sort of question is, I can't think of an instance where it would be that specific. But like I said, a lot of the programs, if they provide publicly accessible information about their program, could document it, sort of who implemented it, what their skill level was, how they were implemented, but it really varies. Rachel, Denise, can you think of something I'm not thinking of for this question?
I guess if we're talking about the Diversion I-Guide, where staffing generally comes up is in the program training chapter, and as part of that chapter there is a discussion about assessing the qualifications of staff when you're considering who will go to training. But I think, like Jen was saying, it's very specific to the program that you're thinking about implementing. So some programs do require maybe a master's level degree or years experience, and that would be something you would find out during your implementation process. But past that, we don't give more specifics than that. I think because that does start to get into a level of specificity that it's hard to provide at the kind of level that the I-Guides are focused on. And then in terms of the program database, it's kind of the same deal. If the study actually did go as far as to tell us something like that, like sometimes they might say a PhD level psychiatrist implemented the program in the school or something like that, we can provide that information on the program profiles. But more often than not, evaluation studies don't get into that level of detail. And then one other thing that we do recommend in the I-Guide, and really even in the program database, is that if you want that kind of level of detail, especially about qualifications, if there is a program developer to contact, it's always a good idea to kind of reach out to them to see what they might say about it.
Oh yeah, that's a good point, Rachel, that information. So on each of the program profiles, just to echo the point Rachel made, there is this sort of snapshot, program snapshot, and if a developer or a training and technical assistance provider consented to having their information displayed, it's available and you can get to them, and that's probably the best way to get some of that information. That's a great point. And then it looked like the sort of after just sort of said thank you, and that they're looking to sort of reallocate staff around the sort of best served in the program area. And I would start, to Rachel's point, start with the Diversion I-Guide around the sort of staffing and, sort of participants areas and just as a starting point, and then it may connect you to some additional resources to look at. Okay, we have 2 minutes left, which I think is, and I don't see another question in the Q&A, so I think with this we will transition back to William, who will close out the webinar formally. But since before we do that, I just wanted to thank everyone for joining us today. Again, really appreciate the feedback, appreciate the questions, appreciate your participation. If you have additional questions or thoughts, I'm always interested in hearing about them. And like I said, I think William will sort of close us out and give some avenues in which you could do it. But there's also contact information on the Model Programs Guide site. So thank you again, everyone, for participating. And with that, I'll turn it over to William, who has 1 minute.
No worries. Thank you, Jen. And so everyone, just as a quick reminder, you may contact OJJDP or the National Training and Technical Assistance Center via the Help Desk by following the contact information that is on this slide. And just remember, the slides are located in the handouts pod if you want to download and get this contact information again. And just as a reminder to everyone that the recording will be archived in approximately 1 week on OJJDP NTTAC's YouTube channel. For the transcript of the event or any supporting materials, please be sure to contact OJJDP Help Desk, and we can provide those supplemental materials for you. Please take a few minutes to review this disclaimer on the slide. And last and certainly not least, we would appreciate if you would take about 5 minutes to complete the feedback survey to help us improve our training in our future webinars. Again, thank you all for joining us today. Everyone have a great afternoon.